New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Christopher Naughton. I'm happy to be working alongside longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove and co-host Emmy Vadnais. Quick reminder, please click on like, comment, or subscribe. It helps get New Thinking Aloud out to a much larger audience. Well, in the spring of 2024, I had the opportunity to interview author Neil Howe, who wrote the book, The Fourth Turning. And in it, he said that the United States is in a cycle or rhyming or pattern that is reminiscent of the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and World War II. Shortly thereafter, I heard author Nick Dagan saying almost the exact same thing, except he was saying it from an astrological perspective. I had the opportunity to interview Nick on this program, and not only did he offer me some very compelling perspectives on cycles and what was upcoming, he absolutely nailed the 2024 U.S. election. Today, I continue that conversation with professional astrologer Nick Dagan. He is the author of Uranus USA, Astrology Looks at the First Planet and Nation of the New World, where he takes an in-depth look at the cycle of the planet Uranus in the United States chart and what he sees ahead for the nation and the world. He joins us today from his home in Cape Town, South Africa. So Nick Dagan, welcome back to New Thinking Aloud. It's been months since we talked. Let me start here. You and I had a conversation about 6 months prior to the election, and I just want to play this short clip for our audience.
Astrologically speaking, I got to say his chart looks like, this is his moment. His chart looks great in November, and his chart looks appropriately like for him, for better or worse, when the inauguration happens. So, I'm not saying it's going to be.
And I think Jupiter goes into Gemini as well, right?
Jupiter
will be in Gemini?
Jupiter will be conjunct his sun on election night. So it's, on top of everything else. So even though he would still be elected and inaugurated a couple of months before Uranus goes into Gemini, the bulk of that first term is Uranus and Gemini, and all of this, the term that follows it. And, and I'm not going to claim to know any more than that, because we're really heading into weird new territory here. But I'm quite certain that he'll win.
Nick, some people might say, well, astrologers were all over the map when it came to this election, and you have a 50-50 shot anyway. But I really appreciated your eloquence and the underpinning as to why you felt this would come about. You said, get ready for a wild ride here.
Yeah. I don't think it takes much imagination to imagine why I would say such a thing. Right. I think, the 47 presidency is going to be a very different beast than 45. So, we're only so familiar with some of what we're in store for. I'm not doing a victory lap, sure astrologers are supposed to make successful predictions and, pat themselves on the back when they do. And frankly, the whole experience of making this prediction public, was hard also because once Biden was swapped out for Kamala and there was this surge of enthusiasm, I didn't want to be out there discouraging people from participating and getting excited. Until the thing actually happens, it hasn't happened. And yet, paradoxically, at the same time, sitting where I was, with the perspective I had and having this sort of broad astrological perspective on the history of the United States and what the coming 8 years might have in store for us, it wasn't hard to imagine where we're headed. So the way everyone's sort of feeling right now is the way I've been feeling really since 2020, but the last few months have not been fun for that very reason, that I couldn't participate, that I couldn't be optimistic myself, that I couldn't be hopeful. That was the hardest part. And I'm not sure I'll repeat this exercise, at least not in this way.
Some astrologers have taken, have experienced a real blowback, either by, maybe Trump people saying you got it wrong, to Kamala people saying you got it wrong. So in the end, some people said that they're just going to step away from doing this kind of thing because they just don't want to take the heat. And yet, you were out there, and I even recognized some of the comments people were making on YouTube based on the interview that you and I conducted in the summertime, early summertime. And people saying, you're going to get it wrong and that sort of thing. And basically you were saying, hey, I know that I see what's happening. I see the optics, but I'm standing by what I said earlier.
My interview with you was not the only public forum where I made this prediction. And people were understandably dismayed. I mean, the first time I said it publicly, Trump was still, had court dates due, like people were still thinking, oh, he's going to be indicted and that'll be the end of him. When I first started talking about it publicly, so it really seemed, absurd for me to be saying so at the time. And even, when I said it more recently, people didn't want to believe it. And so, I take those comments in stride. It is what it is.
You said something in that earlier interview, which, going back and listening to parts of it and reflecting on it. And I've heard some other people say something similar, that there's something about Donald Trump's chart that really plugs into America. Let's talk a little bit about that, because our discussion last time was about Uranus in the American chart, Uranus and Gemini in the American chart. We're going to cover some of that again, just as a refresher. But let's talk about why Donald Trump is so plugged into America's astrology.
Well, I mean, first and foremost, it has a lot to do with that Uranus and Gemini and the role of that particular transit, that particular planetary transit moving through that part of the ecliptic. It's tropical Gemini, so we're talking about the last third of the arc between the solstice in January and the solstice in June, or more specifically between the equinox in April and the solstice in June. So it's the last third of that arc of time. That's what we call tropical Gemini. And whenever Uranus has moved through that part of the ecliptic, which is an 84-year cycle, and it spends about 7 years in each of the 12 tropical signs, that period has always coincided with really important turning points in American history. 1775 to 1782 was basically the beginning and ending of the Revolutionary War. And then 84 years later, it was 1858 to 1865, going from the Lincoln-Douglas debates to the end of the Civil War. And then it was 1941 to 1949, which was basically U.S. involvement in the Second World War. Going all through the early part of the Cold War, the period where the U.S. was the only superpower, because what happened as soon as Uranus left Gemini in the summer of 1949, I mean, within weeks, the Soviet Union was testing bombs, and then within a few weeks after that, the Chinese Revolution happened, and the Cold War got a lot more complicated. But that was the sort of the last arc of Uranus in Gemini, was the U.S. sort of inheriting, really, this global empire that Britain could no longer contain, but that they were worried would, fall into unfriendly hands or whatever it was, or they wanted the resources. There were a bunch of reasons why things played out that way. But this country that, in 1941, most Americans, it seems, were isolationists. There certainly was a very large portion of them were. I don't know what the actual percentage was, but it was a strong streak in American discourse was just, don't get involved anywhere. And then by the end of that transit, They're literally running the world. So that's sort of the pattern that happens every time Uranus goes through Gemini. The United States has been involved in a war, but more importantly, it's a war that over the course of fighting it, that there's a change, that the country winds up reinventing itself by the end, which is certainly something that really happened those last three times, where it almost becomes an entirely new place. It certainly redefines itself, or redefines its vision, or however you want to put it. I guess Ramaswamy's calling it the national identity, which is something I've heard for decades back in Quebec. But whatever that sort of ghost in the machine is, it's strongly connected to this pattern. So over a decade ago, I wrote this book about the past transits, those three episodes in American history, and I certainly had my eye on this period coming up. And I always knew Donald Trump's natal astrology chart. I've been aware of him since I was in my 20s. But I never, I guess like a lot of people in 2016, I'm thinking, well, he's a TV star. This just isn't viable, But the main thing was, astrologically speaking, I did see that his chart resonated really strongly with the United States. Mm-hmm. But what made it easier to dismiss him as an astrologer was the thought that, well, 2016 isn't supposed to be his time. 2024 is his time. And this is something I said. It wasn't in that clip that you just played, but that was something I said last time as well, that it always seemed to me, even in 2016, well, this is a 2024 guy. He's not a 2016 guy. Why would this be happening now? And that's really what, I think that's still kind of true. I mean, his 45 presidency, like I said, I think is a very different animal than the 47 one. It's pretty commonly believed he didn't expect to win in 2016, and that the presidency sort of landed on him. Whatever the truth behind that is, it's not something I find hard to believe. But whatever the truth behind that is, he certainly expects to be, president this time. There was certainly an intention to win, and more of a sort of, an understanding that he would have the job and that he would take it. So I think that's part of what's different now.
Well, again, the interesting thing, because you were saying how Donald Trump plugs into America. And again, whether people love him or hate him, but this whole notion of, and let's talk just a little bit about Uranus and its nature, because we want to plug into, not only does America have Uranus and Gemini dealing with revolutions, etc., matches up to American Civil War, Revolution, and World War II, Donald Trump also has Gemini. Uranus and Gemini. Yeah.
Well, anyone born between 1941 and 49 has that, or most of them do.
Right.
But what makes Donald Trump's chart unique is that he was born on the day of a lunar eclipse. So the sun is opposite the moon, and they're with the lunar nodes, which is the point on the ecliptic where the sun and moon meet. And Uranus was conjunct the sun in Gemini, opposite the moon in Sagittarius, which is in the process of literally in the middle of a lunar eclipse, although he was born when the sun was above the horizon. So it wouldn't have been obvious in the sky, but astrologically speaking, you have this fusion of these really, the sun and moon, understandably. Even if you know nothing about astrology, you would understand how they'd be the two most defining bodies in an astrological chart. And then Uranus, just to answer your question, the thing about Uranus, astrologically speaking, first of all, it was discovered in 1781, the same year that the American Revolutionary War was ending. It was discovered about 6-7 months before Yorktown, just to put that in perspective for you. And actually, it was discovered within days or maybe a week or so of the Articles of Confederation finally being ratified. I think Maryland was the holdout there, and that was what made it like there was a 2-year gap where they were sort of arguing over borders or something like that and waiting for it to be ratified. And it was finally ratified in March of 1781, the same month that Uranus was discovered. And that's kind of important because this is the first official document that uses the term United States of America. It's the first sort of like governmental document issued by a body that refers to itself as such. So Uranus was discovered in England in 1781, and in fact, William Herschel, the man who discovered the planet, it wasn't his decision to call it Uranus. It wasn't even his decision to call it Herschel, which it was for a time. He wanted to call the planet George. Georgius Sidium, the star of King George, because, of course, his king was King George III. He was even his benefactor. He's even paying his bills, let alone being his king. The same King George III that the United States was fighting the Revolutionary War against. Interestingly, King George III had the sun in Gemini, not unlike Donald Trump, and Uranus was conjunct his sun in Gemini right at the time when Benjamin Franklin was getting the French to agree to fight the Treaty of Amity in 1778 that brought them on board. So there's a whole thing, even just relative to King George III in the Revolutionary War. Patrick Henry was another sun in Gemini from that period who had the Uranus conjunct his sun at the time that he made the famous speech as the war was breaking out. Whether he actually said, give me freedom or give me liberty or give me death, he said something like that, and it's the kind of thing he would have said. So that's another sort of instance there. But long story short, Uranus being discovered in 1781, it's the first planet discovered that can't be seen with the naked eye. It's very, very, once in a while it can be seen with the naked eye, but it's very rare. And so it was discovered with a telescope by William Herschel. So it's the first one discovered using modern technology. It's the first post-Saturnian planet discovered. So it really was, its discovery was opening up a new age, in science, in our idea of space and what was out there. And astrologically speaking, Uranus has to do with technological innovation, and also the revolutionary ideal. Certainly, the sort of the idea of independence and sort of more personal independence, shall we say, as opposed to Neptune, which was discovered a few decades later, which astrologers see being more of a collectivist kind of body. Uranus is about sort of personal independence and technology. I almost, I'm this close to just saying Uranus signifies the United States of America in terms of what it introduced to the world culturally and technologically. And when I say that, I mean that in a way that if I had Ronald Reagan and Fidel Castro sitting on either side of me, that they would both agree with whatever it is I mean by that. In other words, it's bigger than any of us. So with that in mind, and certainly because Uranus was discovered as the Revolutionary War was ending, and because there's this ongoing pattern relative to American history, this was the main factor that gave me confidence that Trump would win this election. And like I said in that last interview, not just win it, but win it, and win it in a way that he hadn't won it in 2016.
So this may be the great American reset. And again, as you brought up last time, and I think others have explained it as well, America goes through these existential crises, some between 80 and 90 years, about 80 every 84 years. And again, they are existential. The American Revolution was both a fight within and without. Civil War was a fight within. World War II, there were some internal battles too between, labor and, communism, labor, and fascism. We had a really robust fascist population. America First, Charles Lindbergh. A lot of this is lost to history, or if you haven't studied history that deeply, you don't realize the kind of fissures we had within our own country. It's just that World War II kind of superseded that, and Roosevelt, kind of ran it right down the middle. But I love what you say
I just wanted to add that at the same time, the Civil War had an international component to it. War almost could have broken out with England and with France, and because Britain couldn't access the cotton coming out of the South, they turned India into a cotton making industry, and today the Indian flag has a cotton spinning wheel on it, thanks to Gandhi, who protested British imperialism by insisting Indians make their own cotton. So you can even see like the Civil War, eventually has Gandhi using that spinning wheel and the spinning wheel being on the Indian flag. So in so many different ways and of course, I think we might have mentioned last time, I'm from Montreal. in Canada, not in the United States. And Montreal was very involved in the Civil War. When John Wilkes Booth was, caught and killed, one of the things they found in his pocket was a receipt from the St. James Hotel in downtown Montreal. Which a hotel that's still there today. There were Confederates there. There were even I read recently. There's a really fascinating book about the Civil War in Montreal. Apparently, Confederate and Union agents, this is true, were meeting in Montreal to do cotton deals, like doing business, even though they were at war, and they had to do this business in Montreal, like away from everything. But it sounds crazy, but that was happening. People still needed to get business moving and what have you. So it gets kooky like that. There's none of these wars are ever really contained. And when you think about Mexico, everyone knows about Cinco de Mayo, but the Cinco de Mayo happens in 1862. The Mexicans are fighting off the French. Why are they doing that? Well, the French think the Americans are distracted, and this is time to go create an empire there. And Canada's Confederation is 1867, 2 years after the Civil War ended. That's not a coincidence. They didn't just decide to do that then. It's very much a reaction like, oh my God, they're burning their cities down there. We got to, build a railway and secure, build. It was the build the wall mentality that maybe some folks where you are familiar with today. Got to keep those people out. That was, I'm not trying to be, provocative here. That was the mindset at the time. So, these wars have, even the Civil War has a very strong global component. I'm sorry, I went on too long about that, and you were about to ask me something.
No, I'm a history wonk myself, so it doesn't bother me. Hopefully people in the audience are getting something out of it. But I think bottom line is this: these periods, and again, historians would back this up, even though they'd never use astrology, and we'll talk about that in a moment. These periods that we go through of conflagration, of conflict, and of chaos, which is clearly what at least half the population and maybe more is concerned about, and internationally they're concerned about it as well, that America obviously at some point in time, though, goes through a revolution and comes out the other side looking like something that you would never even have thought about before the conflict or the chaos began, which lends itself to that often in world history, going through the greatest conflicts, the world is reset. This could be, and again, for better or worse, but this could be the great American reset that we're looking at right now. Yeah.
We could argue that those three other periods were great American resets as well. Certainly, in all three cases, no one going into the situation was actually trying to make what happened on the other end happen. People like Washington and Franklin were loyal Englishmen up until, it was just no longer tenable. Any of them, Adams, even more so. Ditto for Lincoln's vision and ditto for Roosevelt. I don't think he saw, an American empire on the other side of all that. They were just coping with, what was in front of them and doing what they thought had to be done. And then things snowball. That's the really consistent part of the pattern as well is that it's nobody's really controlling the thing. It's got a life of its own.
And yet there's that rhyming that goes on. We always like to talk about the fact that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And astrology, and I loved what you said last time, is like a clock with 11 hands. So nothing is actually specifically the same, but it has a rhyming aspect to it. And I want to bring that up in the context of two other things that we barely touched on last time. And one is the notion that Jupiter conjuncted Uranus last year, and that happened at the time, and it was in an eclipse, as I recall. Well, not an eclipse, but it was I don't know, it was some celestial event. They conjuncted.
It was following some eclipse. Yeah.
Right. It was following. Thank you. And that happened in 1858, again, right before the Civil War, right when Uranus was just about going into Gemini, and also in 1941. So you add that fuel to the fire. Let's talk about that. And then after that, I want to talk about Pluto, because again, that makes a turn around the sun every 248 years. And of course, our nation is going into its, I think, 249th year now. But let's talk a little bit about the conjunction that took place and how that may be a hallmark and also a callback to some of these other existential crises and resets we've had in the past.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Jupiter-Uranus relative to those other periods, it's the technology that's going to make those wars very different. You know, in 1858, those telegraphs are going up. That's going to, so Lincoln's going to have what at the time seemed like text messages updates of battles. He's getting news very suddenly, whereas if the war had happened 10 years earlier, there would have been nothing like that. And of course, railroads, are available, which hadn't been up until that point, and that tends to tie in pretty closely with the Jupiter-Uranus thing. Similarly, I mean, the miracle of 1941 going into early 1942 and Jupiter-Uranus in that period is the arsenal of democracy, right? I mean, just people forget just how little, in terms of munitions and armaments there were in the United States, and how quickly all that had to be put together. So sort of like industrializing the war in a way that really hadn't been done like that. I mean, it really takes, Hitler by complete surprise. No one expects the Americans virtually pull a bunny out of the hat. I mean, it really seems like that. It really seems like, where's all this coming from? So now with this year, maybe maybe we're just too close. I don't have the historical perspective to understand exactly what's at play there. I mean, aside from the technology, I'd say that the other thing that Jupiter brings to a conjunction with Uranus is really strong ideological, sort of purity, for want of a better word. Jupiter is all about believing. If you're religious, Jupiter is God. If you're an atheist gambler, Jupiter is luck. We don't all have a God, but we do all have a Jupiter. We do all have something that we really know to be true. That's sort of an unshakable conviction of ours. And when you get, and Uranus on its own already has a very sort of ideological tinge to it. It's very much an idealistic planet, but almost like adolescent in terms of how it's just sort of purely ideal with none of the realism of Saturn involved. So you combine Jupiter and Uranus together, and you're just getting very strong ideological forces as well, which I think is also, I mean, again, 1858, it's the Lincoln-Douglas debates really sort of setting the terms of the discourse. And certainly I think the Jupiter-Uranus, happening this year certainly centered around that as well. I mean, to a large degree, this election was fought almost entirely on ideological. There's not a lot about tax break here. There's mostly about like we think this and those people think that, and vice versa. So I think that's another sort of common thing here.
Yeah, and that's another part of these repetitive cycles is that there seems to be this apogee of polarization. Now you might argue, well, that really didn't happen in America, but it was coming close to happening in America, and perhaps again it was a genius like Franklin Roosevelt that was able to thread that needle between communist socialist forces on one end and Nazism and fascism on the other, but clearly, as you said earlier, these were international events as well. And it seems, I mean, and again, Neil Howe discusses this in The Fourth Turning, which we talked about last time I interviewed Neil. And it's this whole notion that between 80 and 90 years, about the length of a human being's life, in that if they're in that 80 years or so, the 20-year periods, there's the first, second, third, and fourth turnings. That fourth turning seems to be one of existential crisis. So the bottom line is that every 84 years or so, whether you want to say it lines up with Uranus and Gemini or it's a fourth turning, what happened, it just happens to be that the world seems to go through these kinds of conflicts. Who knows who plants the seeds? Who knows why this cycle is the way it is? Who knows the mind of God? I don't know. And I would have to say also that we're always, as human beings, we're always looking to be hopeful, and we're always looking for that silver lining. So before we get into Pluto, because we've got to get there too, because that's really rich. Where is some of the silver lining in what is coming about? What can we look forward to as opposed to merely the chaos and some would say conflict that seems to be the hallmark of these repetitive cycles?
That's a really good question. I do have an answer, but I'm sorry that it's not tomorrow or next year. It's about 2032, 2033, around then. At the tail end of the Uranus transit in Gemini, there's going to be a conjunction with Saturn. And Saturn-Uranus conjunctions, very often, I call it the sort of the defiant ones transit, if you will. You might remember there was a movie in 1959, Sidney Poitier. It's about these two convicts. They've escaped from prison in the South, and their ankles are chained together, and they have to run through the bayou and escape the police and the hound dogs and all that, and make their way to safety. But one of them's black and one of them's a white racist, so they're really antagonistic towards each other and hate each other. But their ankles are chained, and so they have to cooperate despite how they feel about each other. And that's a great sort of Saturn-Uranus conjunction. It brings together very unlikely partnerships or cooperation, or it sort of compels people to cooperate. The last Saturn-Uranus conjunction we had was in 1988. And this was, the Angolan War was ending for South Africa. The Soviets were pulling out of Afghanistan. Reagan's going to Moscow to sign an anti-nuclear treaty. I mean, mind blown. People forget that happened. Just all over the world, whatever Iran, Iraq had been at war for 8 years. That was ending then. Wherever there was, most of these issues that had really dogged us through most of the 80s seem to be wrapping up, and people really seem to be trying to work together to make things, work out. Prior to that,
precursor to the Berlin Wall falling the very next year.
Right. That was a Saturn-Neptune conjunction thing, because that was the nature of the beast with that. And that's a whole thing in and of itself. But the Saturn-Uranus was the corruption. The Saturn-Neptune was, the sort of the sudden dissolution, or that big change in regime. Saturn-Neptune conjunctions have a whole history with Russia that goes back centuries, but I won't digress there for now. Prior to the one in 88, there was a Saturn-Uranus conjunction in 1942, just at the end of Taurus, before Uranus went back into Gemini the second time. And that was the conjunction of the US-Soviet alliance against the Nazis. I mean, again, that would have seemed really unlikely until not long before that. There was existing hostility between the two largely. But they put it aside, and the US started sending the same sort of lend-lease materials that it had been sending Britain. So
so again,
with that in mind,
go ahead.
I just like looking ahead. As divided as everything is, at some point we are compelled to work things out. I think the thing about the Great Reset is it is one of these moments we've seen before in American history as well, where the definition of left and right and party alliances and what have you also move around. This has happened before in American history, and it's even more familiar to us, I would say, than all the wars we've been talking about. So that's clearly happening as well. So wherever we wind up in the 2030s, there is some attempt to move forward together.
Right. And let's say that even during the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and World War II, there were things, certainly in individuals' lives, that moved forward. I mean, I think sometimes there's this notion, especially right after an election, again, maybe half the people are super elated, the other half are deeply depressed. Is that even in different, and one should always, say, be careful what you wish for, because you just never know what it may turn into. There's a great quote out of the Course in Miracles. I do not know what anything is for. And I guess another way of looking at that would be, you think one way, you think, oh, this is good, but it may not be, or this is terrible, it may not be. And I would just, to remind the viewers is that in those existential crisis periods, as baleful as they were, people demonstrated extraordinary courage. There were huge technological gains. There were great discoveries and inventions. There were, in some instances, deeper spiritual pursuits. So I guess what I'm saying here, Nick, is that even though on a broad sense we're going through what appears to be a chaotic, conflicting period, for individuals and for rather, pockets of peoples and populations, there could be some dynamic breakthroughs here as well.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a little bit of the Uranian energy too. I mean, Uranus is also about shocks and surprises, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. It absolutely is. And you mentioned Pluto going into Aquarius, and certainly the interactions between Uranus and Pluto, and they're going to be trying each other now. They're both moving into air signs. So that does promise a considerable sort of leap, I'd say, technologically, and I'm going to use a word I don't use very much, despite the fact that I'm an astrologer. Consciously, consciousness is going to another level as well. I do think 2025 is going to be a year of such thorough cultural shifts that, the 2024 and before is going to seem like, it might as well be the Victorian age. We might as well have, hoop skirts and big sideburns and all that stuff, sepia photos, it'll seem that sort of quaint. I mean, not unlike, the young people today look at the rotary phones that you and I had to use when we were young, but even more sort of divorced from that. I don't want to sound like a ranting crazy person, but
right.
In astrology, whenever one of these outer planets changes sign, which doesn't happen that often, Uranus being the fastest, that's every 7 years. For Neptune and Pluto, it's considerably longer. But every time they do, there's always a shift in the culture. We move forward in some way. And but this is a year where all three of them are changing sign at the same time. So it's a different, it's a different change. It's not like we're
greater
just
intensity. Would it be fair to say just greater intensity with all three of those planets changing signs?
Yeah. But also, I mean, real newness. Things being living in a different world, and some of us really fitting in nicely with it, and some of us feeling left behind by it.
Wow. We've been talking about mostly focusing on Uranus and how, again, there's a great American reset every time it goes there every 84 years. But this is the first time in the country's history that now the planet Pluto has made a full circle around the sun. Every 248 years, Pluto makes an entire journey around the sun. So in some ways, we talk about American reset. This is almost putting us back at the beginning again. Talk a little bit about what Pluto represents and how that impacts us, or what that reflects moving forward in the American chart, in American culture.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the one hand, we discovered Pluto in 1930, just a couple of months after the stock market crash, maybe 3 months later. And in astrology, we tend to think of Pluto in very 20th century terms. It's big banks, big corporations. The non-astrologers have coined this term that just fits beautifully with the astrology: plutocracy. You don't even need to be an astrologer to understand the connection, but that's very much what Pluto sort of signifies in astrology, amongst other things. And But indeed, in 1778, it made its ingress into Aquarius, where it spent the next 19 years. So we're talking about starting from that moment I was talking about when Benjamin Franklin convinced King Louis XVI to back the American revolutionaries against the English. With money and ships and all that, and that really winds up being a pretty critical element in the eventual victory. But it's also it triggers the unraveling, the eventual French Revolution. France winds up going broke, and this is the thing. I mean, I tend to think of the American Revolutionary War as being part of this larger event, the sort of the global chain of revolutions that do all refer to each other.
Mm-hmm.
The French Revolution happened because the king spent all that money on the American Revolutionary War, and then because the French Revolution happened, Haiti had a revolution, and suddenly you have this big slave uprising. They're taking over, making a country of their own island, and then later, because Napoleon invades Spain and Portugal, and their monarchies are thrown into chaos. There's all these revolutions in Latin America, Mexico down to Argentina. They all owe that to this chain of revolutions, and then Greece sees this happening and they're like, we don't want to be under the Ottomans anymore. And they go for it. And then eventually, of course, the Russians go for it. And then after the Russians go for it, everyone wants to do and when the Russians are doing it, they're very much referring to the French Revolution. They're thinking about everything in terms of the French Revolution. They're worried about Trotsky because he might be a Napoleon, all that stuff. And then when the Chinese Revolution happens in 1949, they're thinking very much like, in terms of Stalin and Lenin and all that. So it has been a chain. You can in some way, in the same way that we look back at the Crusades, which was really a series of different wars that took place over the course of several centuries, but we call them the Crusades. And someday I can imagine, that they'll just talk about this 250-year period as, the revolutionary period when, that started with the American Revolution and which in turn snowballed into all these other global events. And now we find ourselves, Pluto coming back into Aquarius. And this is one full return since early 1778, when the American Revolutionary War became a global affair. I'd say that's the big change going from 1777 to 1778. It's no longer just between Britain and some of its colonists. It's serious.
So this might be United States Chapter 2 in some ways, at least the Plutonian Chapter 2.
Yeah. Yeah, or the global revolution snowball Chapter 2 as well. And however that fits in with everything else, because no matter, I think pretty much anything that happens in the United States has global impact at this point, and has had since, I guess it was at least since the last time Uranus was in Gemini, and if you're in Latin America, longer than that. So with that in mind,
certainly the Great Depression in 1929.
Yeah,
and
certainly
that
exactly.
Too.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. Yeah. So with that in mind, you can, there's all kinds of ways that this can change things globally. But for the United States, we are in the difference with this period is not only is Uranus in Gemini like it was in all those other wars we're talking about, but we're back to that period like we were in during the second half of the Revolutionary War when Uranus was in Gemini and Pluto was in Aquarius. And that's what's on the table now. And then Neptune going into Aries. The last time Neptune went into Aries was in April of 1861, literally the day of Fort Sumter. So
my goodness,
it's the trifecta of there's all these different references to these different wars happening at once.
Well, since you used the word, maybe this is, and of course it's a subtitle to a book I wrote, but maybe this is a new American revolution in consciousness.
Yeah. It has to be.
Right. If it's going to, if the story repeats itself and we get through that 7-8 year period of conflict and chaos and the country reinvents itself, then one would think would have to be an elevation in consciousness to get through to the other side, as opposed to being burned down or conquered or what have you. Hey, let me take a little sidestep here to the left,
Sure.
because, here on this channel, New Thinking Aloud channel, we have the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks who are very much involved in ufology. And we're not just talking about the people who opine, but we're talking about, for example, a Danny Sheehan who's been on this program, who's literally at the legal forefront of the UAP Disclosure Act. And just now, again, I would not expect, the national security state to release all of its secrets regarding its research into ufology over the last 80 years, speaking about cycles, but they are supposed to disgorge that information according to the law, and it may take several cycles of the law pushing for this information. But is there anything astrologically that looks at releasing this kind of very sensitive information? According to Danny Sheehan and others, we have, somewhere we have the technology, we have the biology, and some people are even talking about first contact. So that's some of the stuff that comes across on the channel. And you're thinking aloud. Can you address any of this in an astrological sense?
Yeah, it's tough overall. I've looked at the chart of Roswell and some other sightings. I had one myself in 2011 in Montreal that I couldn't believe nobody was talking about, even though there were loads of people around. But I never saw a word written about it. I know what I saw with my eyes. I'll say this. It is kind of a slippery eel, astrologically speaking, because there isn't a historical foundation for me to stand on. What I will say, I referred earlier to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction that's happening next year. It starts at sort of at the end of May of 2025 and extends right into the early half of 2026. And that conjunction very often gives us clarity and a kind of a new insight that hasn't, even if things have been right in front of our faces, it's when we notice them or realize them, or some new kind of technology comes around that opens up our minds and gives us a different view of the world. I mentioned in 1989 was the last one. That was when the Berlin Wall came down, and you said, that was on the heels of the Gulf War happening, and suddenly we were watching war happen in real time. I mean, sure, Vietnam people saw the war on the news every night at dinner time, but you remember the Gulf War of early '91. The world that we're familiar with today, where CNN was on 24 hours, and you were watching a war unfold over the course of those 24 hours. That was a very new thing. That was very sort of Saturn-Neptune. The previous Saturn-Neptune conjunction was in 1952-53. This was a period when it was the first American presidential election that was televised. And also the Queen Elizabeth, was coronated queen, or she had her coronation, and that was televised. So in both the United States and Great Britain, people suddenly went out and bought televisions in huge numbers. Like, it's the big spike in the 50s where TV goes from a sort of niche luxury to basically something families had in their homes. And and those are the two sort of events that really trigger it. And it was very Saturn-Neptune. And it might not seem like a big deal to us now, but yeah, suddenly having a TV set in your living room changed your world considerably, and it's that sort of new insight into things. So, are the UAPs like the television experience of tomorrow? I guess on one hand it doesn't seem like a good analogy, but this is the kind of thing that you see with Saturn Neptune, is we're suddenly become aware of a world that was until then closed off from us, or that we just couldn't see properly, or we become aware of information. The walls come down, So in that sense, it's possible. And like I said, I expect the world to change really, really radically next year. And it almost would take that kind of thing, like having Trump be president almost isn't quite enough for it to be that powerful. So, I'm speculating here, but I think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen quite soon. Like, before the second half of 2026 at the latest.
Before we leave, our conversation today, and even the Trump presidency, what do you see for Donald Trump himself? What are his aspects like? I know they're pretty grand right now, and when he gets inaugurated, I think you said last time it's great conjunctions and great trines for him at that point. What do you see over the next several years?
I see him going through a lot of changes. He's not going to be the same man when all this shuts down. I mean, I don't, unless he perishes in office really soon or something. If he goes the duration, let's say, presuming that.
Mm-hmm.
And I say that only because he's getting on in years. But if he goes the distance and sees out this term and whatever's sort of beyond, according to certain threats he's made or things he's suggested, then he's going to come out of this a very different person. I'm not saying redeemed. I'm not saying that he necessarily suddenly becomes a hippie or something like that, but he's going to change in a way that he would not expect to change. That if I could tell him right now, hey, this is who you're going to be 4 years from now or 8 years from now, he wouldn't believe me, and a lot of other people wouldn't believe me. Your YouTube comments section would blow up again. Now, I don't have that kind of insight. I don't know in which way he's gonna change, but Uranus tends to do that. There's also a personal revolution that happens with the whole thing. That there's a person goes through a perspective shift, and they do see things differently. That's
almost
really
true for all of us in a way, don't you think, Nick? I mean, in some ways, I'm almost thinking you're talking about Donald Trump, and I'm thinking I might not recognize myself in 4 years. I don't think that it's almost as if we don't know what kind of changes are going to take place and how we could dramatically be transformed here.
Yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, I think that's absolutely true. Not unlike what I was saying about, say like people before the First World War were still Victorian. They still had the hoop skirts and the big sideburns, what have you. And then you get the First World War and it changes everything. And when it's over 4 years later, men have short hair. We're driving cars. There's radio. There's women are smoking and going to bars and voting. Oh my God. I mean, it's a totally different, it's radically different if you think about it. And some people were there and totally ready to live in this new world. And some people were like, what the heck just happened? Where's that world? Where's my hoop skirt? That is kind of what we're in for. And I think how, some like the internet, how did the internet change us as people? I think it kind of had an effect on my personality in some ways. I'm sure the same is true for you. So, but this is, I would imagine, sort of a magnified version of that. I was going to say, I do think nonetheless for Trump personally, for a guy who's really, who's got a very narrow focus, who's interested in only a very certain number of things. I'm talking about, something quite fundamental there that does shift.
Mm-hmm. And you probably don't have an astrological prediction for this, but when are astrologers going to stop yelling at each other? It's been a lot of that, huh? Or am I just reading certain aspects of it, of the field?
This happens. They're human beings. There's one astrologer who, I had a conversation with her on Twitter or whatever they're calling it these days, over a year ago. And we both said we thought Trump was going to win. But then at the last minute, she was invited on The Daily Show. And she said Kamala Harris on The Daily Show changed her prediction, even though she was on record saying Trump prior to that. And she's getting a lot of heat because she reversed her prediction and reversed it in the wrong direction.
Right.
Look, it's, I feel for anyone on the wrong side of an internet, shaming. It's not anything anyone wants to go through. No doubt I would have been going through it, had I been wrong, but it would have been worth it for the world for me to be wrong. It's a pity, but they're human beings. I don't expect any better from them from anyone else. I don't expect worse from them than anyone else, but I don't expect better. They're people.
Nick Dagan best. The book is Uranus USA. Astrology looks at the first planet and nation of the world. His website is nickdaganbestastrologer.com. He joined us today from South Africa. Nick, thank you so much. I dare say our conversation is going to continue. Thanks for your insights and
Thank you.
Standing by what you had to say. And I think that goes a long way in those people who are tuning into us and like to hear what our insights might be, because there's no airtight way of predicting the future. That's the nature of the future. And we always have choice. And that really is what it comes down to. The collective always has choice, but there are indices, and it's good to talk about those things and also to find the light behind some of the darkness that seems to descend upon Earth. So thanks, Nick. I appreciate you being here. Any last words before we go today?
No, thank you again for having me, Christopher. I really appreciate your audience's interest in the subject. And I'm at nickdaganbestastrologer.com, available for consultations and occasional questions. So come find me.
Sounds great, my friend. We'll be in touch once again. For all of us here at New Thinking Aloud, for longtime host Jeffrey Mishlove, co-host Emmy Vadnais, for all the great volunteers, I'm Christopher Naughton. Thank you for being here. For you, after all, are the reason that we're here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.